Hey there, my name is David Awad. I'm going to be presenting on the paper Understanding the Mirai Botnet. This was presented at Usenix in 2017. Oh, look at that. There's my Twitter handle in the corner. How'd that happen? All right, let's get on with it. The goals of this presentation, we are going to talk about what botnets are, what Mirai is, tracking and analysis of Mirai, and the conclusions. These are the sort of high-level topics that they went over in the paper. So without further ado, let's get started. I want to start by defining some terms. Just for those of you who may already be familiar with cybersecurity, this may be a little bit unnecessary. Feel free to skip ahead. Just want to define some terms real quick. Malware is software that is specifically designed to disrupt, damage, or gain unauthorized access to a computer system. A botnet is a network of private computers infected with malware and controlled as a group without the owner's knowledge. IoT is short for Internet of Things devices. These are non-standard computing devices that connect wirelessly to a network and have the ability to transmit data, such as, but not limited to, a smart refrigerator, let's say. C&C is short for command and control traffic, referred to in the paper as C2 or C2C traffic. DOS or DOS is short for a denial of service attack. An attack intended to prevent a particular service from working correctly. This can come from anywhere on the internet and is usually executed in the form of lots of traffic. DDoS is short for a distributed denial of service attack, which is to say, an attack from a distributed set of sources. A bulletproof hosting provider is a hosting provider that allows their customer considerable leniency in the kinds of material they may upload and distribute, such as suspicious material, namely, a honeypot is a device that appears to be legitimate, but for our purposes is actually isolated and carefully monitored. A network telescope is a system that can observe different large-scale events taking place on the open internet. CWMP is the CPE WAN management protocol, which defines support functions for configuration management, usually for routers. All right, so what is Mirai? Mirai is a botnet that took control of various IoT devices and used them to attack high-profile sites in 2016. It was authored by Paris Zhou, Josiah White, and Dalton Norman. Funny enough, one of my best friends was actually friends with Zhou, the main author. He was also one of my colleagues when we were both undergraduates in computer science at Rutgers in 2016. It's a shame he never realized that crime doesn't pay. He's a reckless renegade, a loose cannon. He plays by his own rules. He thinks rules are made to be broken. He's a man on the edge with nothing to lose. And he wasn't in computing for the right reasons. And perhaps in the end, the only mystery he really needed to solve was himself. Anyway, so let's get on with talking about how Mirai propagates. Mirai starts out with an attacker sending malicious traffic through from device to device. Once the first device is infected, it begins scanning its environment for Telnet or SSH-enabled devices and attempts to log in using a series of hard-coded passwords from a dictionary. Not a very sophisticated attack, but one that was ultimately very effective. If login is successful, it sends this information to a report server. That's this server right here in our diagram. And if the report server gets contacted, if it hears from a new device, it triggers a loader to infect the device it was just contacted by. Those infected machines then go on to scan for additional victims and accept commands from a CNC server. This is how the virus spreads. Once machines were infected, they would receive commands over the internet from the CNC server. Mirai's weapon of choice was a DDoS attack using the various infected devices. It's important to remember that these were functionally random machines from all over the internet. Any device connected to the internet could have been vulnerable. Mirai was in fact able to infect, at least we only know of, 1.2 million devices. And Zhou had made available to him essentially an army of internet-enabled toasters, refrigerators, light bulbs, and security cameras to do his bidding. So how was Mirai discovered? Mirai was actually discovered after some attacks on high-profile web services in 2016, namely after attacking the popular DNS service provider Dyn, which supports services like Spotify, AWS, and PayPal. They were affected and unreachable for a short period of time. I believe it was 72 hours. As a fun fact, my own school, Rutgers University, when I was an undergrad, was also attacked by Mirai. It took down the school's central authentication system during finals week, funny enough, my senior year, and caused the university a whole lot of problems. These kinds of highly visible attacks are probably what got Mirai a lot of attention from law enforcement and ultimately got the authors prevented from performing, future attacks. So let's talk about Mirai's tracking. The goals of this paper, research-wise, were to snapshot the IoT botnet phenomenon so that future researchers can have an understanding of the benchmarks and what kinds of botnets are out there, to reconcile a broad spectrum of botnet data perspectives, and to understand Mirai's mechanisms and motives. So, in order to find a snapshot of the botnet phenomenon, a company called Census was contacted. This is an organization that operates an internet telescope. They actively scan the entire IPv4 space and aggregate layer 4 data about all hosts on the internet. After some filtering, researchers compiled a list of about 1.2 million Mirai infected device manufacturer makes and models. The botnet came to be subdivided into various clusters depending on which C2C servers they were pointing to for their commands. The top 6 clusters by C2 domain count consisted of highly connected components, which represented agile, long-lived infrastructures in use by the botmasters. Unfortunately, there was not enough data to conclusively identify a manufacturer and model for all devices due to limitations on the information provided by FTP, Telnet, and CWMP connections. Researchers were, however, able to conclusively identify 31.5% of the devices affected. So, to quote the paper, as far as some of the snapshots, we estimate a number of Mirai-infected devices over time by tracking the number of hosts actively scanning with Mirai fingerprint at the start of every hour. Mirai started by scanning Telnet, and variants evolved to target 11 additional protocols. The total population initially fluctuated between 200,000 to 300,000 devices before receding to about 100,000 devices with a brief peak of 600,000 devices. And you can see the largest peak being around December of 2016, right over here. Mirai scanning began on August 1st, 2016 from a single IP address in a bulletproof hosting center. Mirai infection spread rapidly with a 76-minute doubling time and quickly matched the volume of non-Mirai telnet scanning. So, other things worth noting, the password dictionary was also changing with time in different clusters of infected devices. In order to track this, telnet honeypots were set up to seem like vulnerable IoT devices. Any traffic that came to them was captured and carefully monitored in order to analyze any binaries and malware downloaded to it via curl or wget. Over the course of the, and I quote, over the course of our 5-month botnet infiltration, we observed Mirai operators issuing 15,000 DDoS attacks, excluding duplicate attacks, that is. These attacks employed a range of different resource exhaustion strategies. 32.8% were pure volumetric attacks, 39.8% were TCP state exhaustion attacks, and 34.5% were application layer attacks. While amplification attacks make up 74% of attacks issued by DDoS for higher booster services, only 2.8% of Mirai attack commands relied on bandwidth amplification, despite built-in support in Mirai's source code. This absence highlights Mirai's substantial capabilities despite the resource constraints of the devices involved. Let's just take a look at the timeline here really quickly. Mirai surfaces at the beginning in August of 2016. It begins relatively low profile until September 18th, where it starts making some more high profile attacks, such as the Krebs on security blogs peak attack on September 21st. The source code of Mirai was leaked later that month, and then 1 month later, in October, the Dyn attacks happened, affecting services like AWS, Reddit, Twitter, Netflix. Later on in that same month, 10 days later, the Liberia Lone Star attacks begin. After that, the Deutsche Telekom CWMP exploits start becoming widespread. A few months later, the Mirai authors are identified and the attackers are arrested shortly thereafter. The most major attacks being these over here in red. Those are the attacks that had the highest number of devices performing the DDoS attacks. So to look back at Mirai's motives and think about some of the events that happened here to try to understand what the goals may have been. On October 21st, 2016, Dyn suffered attacks that disrupted DNS resolution for sites like I mentioned earlier, Reddit, Amazon, GitHub, Netflix, PayPal, and Reddit. Whoops. So, Rutgers University was taken down for almost 2 weeks as it dealt with Mirai's cyber attacks. Mirai attacked the popular Krebs on Security blog with DDoS attacks, reaching an unprecedented 600 gigabits per second, this being the largest cyber attack ever recorded. Later attacks would actually turn out to target not just Dyn, but the PlayStation name servers, Xbox Live servers, Fallout game servers, and more. These attacks make sense as the authors were all within the age range of 18 to 25. If you ask me, my personal opinion is that these were hackers who were trying to make a name for themselves and see what they could get away with, especially given that they attacked low-profile blog targets such as Krebs on Security, which didn't have anything of value for the authors to get out of them, as it's just a blog. And attacking things like video game hosting services just seems silly. Mirai was also used as a botnet for rent. Cybercriminals could contact the owners for time on the botnet to attack the targets of their choice. It later turned out federal prosecutors worked with Zhou to identify over 30 different cyber criminals. Zhou worked for over 100 hours to find these cyber criminals and bring them to justice after having been found guilty, of course, in exchange for a lighter sentence. So it's worth noting that the vast majority of the vulnerabilities exploited were due to predictable passwords. Quite literally, Mirai would scan and find available devices that were using Telnet or SSH and just try using passwords that were predictable, using a dictionary like we were describing earlier. In addition, there were many vulnerabilities due to the devices in question having much older versions of software packages, operating systems, and protocols. While these packages and operating systems get out of date, their vulnerabilities get published shortly after they are patched. So those vulnerabilities are out in the open, and if they are not updated quickly enough, those vulnerabilities are still exploitable, and IoT devices happen to be a particularly vulnerable market for these sorts of attacks. One protocol worth mentioning specifically that was particularly vulnerable for Deutsche Telekom was the CWMP protocol, which operates usually at the router level. So let's take a look at some conclusions that we can take away from this. On average, each device involved in the Mirai attack is estimated to have cost its individual owners about $13.50 per device. It is projected that roughly $110 million in potential revenue was lost due to Mirai attacks, including a substantial portion of the entire communications infrastructure of Liberia. Mamma Mirai, that's a lot of damage. So in conclusion, the takeaway for device manufacturers and IoT infrastructure maintainers is to not use standard or obvious passwords. Don't let your IoT devices sit on the public internet. Use firewalls and IP whitelists carefully to control who can and can't communicate with your IoT-enabled devices. Namely, a smart fridge cannot safely encrypt a Wi-Fi password. But perhaps the most important lesson of all to take away from this is that crime doesn't pay. Thank you very much for your time. This has been a fun exercise for me, and I hope you all enjoyed it. As a last note, there are some useful resources and references worth taking a look at, namely the paper itself, the Krebs on security blog post on the subject, and the Mirai source code is available on GitHub. The majority of it is written in C with a little bit of Perl and Python as well. Here are some additional articles that may be worth taking a look at. I will link to all of these in the description below. So, thank you very much again. Looking forward to all kinds of new academic opportunities in the future. Hope to hear from you all again soon. Thanks.